Hello. Good evening. Oh, here we go. Don't know why that muted. Oh well. Wait. Yeah, so just going over a paper today. Should be fine. Not Japan study specific, but it's interesting. So yeah. I'll give it a couple minutes. Then we can move on. How are things going this evening for folks? Like I'm just trying to do this a day earlier than my normal stream schedule because I may decide to go to an anime convention tomorrow, just for a day. So I kind of wanted to like clear my calendar a little bit for that, but still a couple other things going on, so I'm just gonna kind of wait until the last minute. Did they have anime conventions in the Edo era? I don't think so. On account of like no anime. Paper play meetups. Yes. Maybe people had conventions for kabuki actors, Yeah, who knows? Yeah, I'm not sure what the term is either for that. Wait, I'm gonna switch over. Yeah. There we go. Kamishibai. And yeah, 20th century. Yeah. Oh, is that like the golden bat thing? I think. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that's like definitely 20th century. Literally the example photo in Wiki, yeah. It's funny how that has managed to survive through the centuries and is still known, I guess. Although I don't know if there's like anything that's based on that nowadays. But I remember that some studio made an anime about it, like back in the late 80s, or like late 20th century, I should say. Anyway, so here is my paper report on J.Z. Smith's In Comparison, A Magic Dwells. And, it's a interesting sounding title. It sounds kind of fun. Anyway, this was an essay that was originally published in 1982. So J.Z. Smith, or Jonathan Z. Smith, was an historian of religion, primarily based at the University of Chicago. This particular paper is considered a seminal work in the field of the history of religion. And the exercise of comparative religions was kind of a primary focus of much of the late 19th and 20th centuries. And this paper is ultimately about that kind of exercise. So what do I mean by that? Like, so we're talking about comparative religions, like the intro and lead-in topic for this essay is kind of like a discussion of the study of Judaism as so-called coming of age. So prior to this, like, Smith asserts that Judaism was frequently studied kind of as material to compare with against other religions rather than on its own terms. And despite this initial topic, though, like, what Smith actually wants to get at is the description and comparison. Like, he wants to talk about, like, how religions, like, get compared with each other and what that means. So, and what do we mean by comparison? So, Smith takes as his example, or takes as a basis, what are known as the laws of association. So laws of association were originally posited by Aristotle and then kind of like worked on by later, like 17th through 19th century philosophers. So like John Locke was associated with it. And essentially there are like three kind of laws that are kind of used in like psychology to some degree. And it's about how people think about different things and comparing things. So the three laws that we're talking about here are the law of contiguity, law of similarity, and the law of contrast. So contiguity is like the association of things that are together in space and time. Similarity is about how if you have two very similar things, so the website that was referenced here kind of talks about, like, if you think about coffee, like, in your mind, you might also like immediately think of tea. And the final one would be the law of contrast. So thinking about one particular thing may actually also think about may trigger the opposite. So if you think about something that's hot, you may end up thinking about something that's cold. So, and why does this matter? Well, Smith brings in like other theorists where they talk about how like this laws of association are kind of in play when people start doing comparative studies. So E.B. Taylor, for example, like discusses, like says, like, any association of, and this is in the paper, so I'm just kind of quoting the paper, quoting Taylor. Like, any association of ideas in a man's mind, the vaguest similarity of form or position, even a mere coincidence in time, is sufficient to enable, what he says, the magician to work from association in his own mind to association in the material world. So basically, it's like you have a scholar, he might be looking for something. He says, like, oh, I've seen something like this before, and it's kind of similar, but so it must be important and related. But the thing is, it's like that association might just be in their head versus like something that's actually objective, like something that you can say that, like, in, like, I guess you could say scientifically, or even like just through like some sort of thing that's outside of your own head. So, so this is kind of what Smith gets at, and also Taylor and Fraser. So they are referring to magic in this case as Fraser says, a confusion of a subjective relationship with an objective one. Where this confusion is not present, the laws of association yield science. Illegitimately applied, they yield magic. So, like, when we say, like, magic in this case, magic is actually bad. You know, in 2026, we're steeped in popular culture and stuff, and like magic kind of sounds nice and fun, but in this case, like, you can maybe think of magic almost more like a sleight of hand. It's just kind of a trick that is played in your mind. That, like, the thing that you see in your head as being like similar or whatever isn't necessarily such. So how does this apply to the human sciences? So just as an aside, the so-called human sciences is a term that Smith likes to use, and it's fundamentally kind of a combination of like the humanities and social sciences. So as the core of this paper, the idea of spurious correlations. Yeah, in a lot of ways it is, although it's not phrased in that sense, because in this particular case, like a spurious correlation is like a statistical correlation between two things. And in this particular case, it's more on the kind of like the observational side of things, I guess. But you're not wrong in that it's two very similar things, where if you have like two... So for those who don't know, like a spurious correlation is a situation where if you have two things or two events or two phenomenon like A and B, and they are statistically correlated with each other, like that correlation does not necessarily imply that one causes the other. So like an example of a spurious correlation is something like ocean temperatures and pirates. Temperatures going up along with an increase in like pirate attacks. So the spurious correlation there may imply that climate change causes pirates, or pirates cause climate change, but in fact neither of these things are related. They just happen to be statistically correlated in the sense that both are going up at the same time. So going back to these human sciences, like what is comparison in this case? Comparison is basically like an exercise in similarity, but that is justified by contiguity. So when Joseph Campbell saw a common pattern in hero narratives across the globe, was he wrong? Well, I think the question there is like, what are we... I'm not sure if right or wrong is the right way to go about saying that. I think like, actually I kind of want to like get back to that in a bit after we start talking about a little bit more of what Smith is trying to get at, because that's actually a pretty good example, I think. Although you may have to assist me in like remembering the more finer points of it. No, don't worry about the derailment. That's actually a pretty good point to bring up, because one of the things I was trying to think about for this review is like, what is the applicability of this essay? And I think that's actually a pretty good it's a pretty good subject to think about. But if we talk about like comparison here, we have the exercise of similarity justified by contiguity. It's basically like, okay, A and B are similar, and clearly it's important to think about it because they're right next to each other. You know, that's the contiguity, essentially. It's like they're next to each other and they're similar. Therefore, it's important for me to talk about this relationship and that they're clearly connected. But the thing is that similarity may be mostly subjective, right? It's basically like post hoc rationalization. So to quote Smith here, it's a process of working from a psychological association to a historical one. It is to assert that similarity and contiguity have causal effect. But this, to revert to the language of Victorian anthropology, is not science but magic. And he also mentions how there's a lot of similarity and contiguity in all these comparative studies, but difference has been all but forgotten. So there's no... if you want to talk about like a common exercise in like college papers and things like that, you know, the compare and contrast. In this case, like comparison is typically associated with like similarity, and contrast is associated with difference. There's a lot of compare and not a lot of contrast. So we can continue with Smith, quoting Smith, because he's usually pretty quotable, I would say. And to be honest, like I think the writing that he does, at least in my experience, tends to be a little bit more complex than the other papers that I tend to read. So like I often find myself like quoting him more than like trying to paraphrase him, simply because I think it is harder for me to paraphrase him. But we are left with a dilemma that can be stated in stark form. Is comparison an enterprise of magic or science? Thus far, comparison appears to be more a matter of memory than a project for inquiry. It is more impressionistic than methodical. So it's very clear that Smith believes that this enterprise is magic. It's not science to him. And Smith proposes to test his hypothesis by examining these, he calls the major modes of comparison that are used in his field. I say his field because he's a religious scholar. Most of the examples he has are from like the history of religions and comparative religious history, which what I will say from the limited experience I have with it tends to have like different historical methods than other like fields of history that I'm familiar with. So like when I read Japanese studies and Japanese history, like the little I've read of like history of religion papers like tends to be very different in how they treat things versus what Japanese history does. So what are these methods of comparison? So Smith basically categorizes like 4 major methods. So he talks about the ethnographic, the encyclopedic, the morphological, and the evolutionary. So it's basically in the slide, but ethnographic is basically a traveler's impressions. It's not exactly methodical to begin with. It's just, okay, I went to here and then I learned about X, Y, and Z. So ethnographic studies. I suppose like Herodotus is kind of like this, if you want to go all the way back to the beginning, because a lot of what Herodotus did was kind of like just put down stories that he heard from people in his travels. So you might also have the encyclopedic, which is essentially an arrangement of topics and material that's typically read from text. And Smith argues that the data is seldomly either explicitly compared or explained. Yeah, so like it's just kind of like implied that the things that are in the comparative history are like similar. You have the morphological, which is what he calls an ahistorical hierarchy of items whose sequence increases in organization complexity. He believes that there has been success in the biological and some human sciences of this technique, but for us as like would-be historians, I don't really consider myself to be like a full historian, but like for folks who want to practice history, like a method that is essentially explicitly ahistoric is kind of problematic. Yeah, so would morphological comparison apply to, say, ritual objects, religious statuary, etc.? Yes. I believe that is one of the items, one of the subjects that where morphological analysis would take place. Just as an aside, like I remember doing some research about J.C. Smith, who has sadly passed away, and someone was going to write about his like work, and mentioned that like one of J.C. Smith's very early fields of study when he was like in college was he went to agricultural college, actually like Cornell Agricultural College, and he had a really great interest in the morphology and like taxonomy of grasses, actually. So like I feel like he has kind of a soft spot for that sort of like, you know, biological taxonomy, although that particular yeah, you get on with Topman. Yeah. Yeah, probably. But yeah, like I mean, and actually Topman was at Northwestern, so they could just like talk to each other, I guess, like going uptown and downtown. But yeah, the thing about grasses, as this person had pointed out, was that the taxonomy of grasses is, and like the analysis of that, like how they're arranged, is actually different than how the like other plants and animals eventually like got organized or sorted. So it's kind of weird how that just sort of ended up being a dead end, and yet that was a thing that he really liked. But talking about things that are sort of inspired by biology but not actually for biology, there's finally the evolutionary method, and Smith is talking very specifically about something that was called the comparative method, and which kind of popped up in the 19th and early 20th century, and he described it as an illegitimate combination of the morphological and the new temporal framework of the evolutionists. So it's like trying to use morphology, but then like trying to assign timing by using evolutionary like traits, like, oh, this certain feature like evolved into this and that. But the reason why it's illegitimate in his eyes is that basically it's still ahistoric, and they're just kind of relying on evolution to like kind of place it within a temporal framework, but without any real history to like ground it. Just to quote Smith a bit more, this impossible and contradictory combination allowed the comparativist to draw his data without regard to time or place, and then locate them in a series from the simplest to more complex, adding the assumption that the former was chronologically as well as logically prior. So, like, there's just an assumption that these things are together, but not actually. Yeah. Artistic styles can make large, abrupt jumps across time too, not really in an evolutionary style. Yeah. Yep. So what's the outcome of, like, Smith going into detail about this? Well, basically he, after in the paper discussing, like, more details about these methods, he basically says that the ethnographic encyclopedic methods are inadequate. The evolutionary model could work, but he hasn't seen, like, an example at the time in 1982 that he felt was satisfactory. And obviously that comparative method that we described was not going to fly. And in his opinion, the morphological remains with some success, but few students of religion would be attracted by this alternative because, as we mentioned, it's ahistoric, right? It's like, yeah, we can see how these things are related, but they're only kind of related in terms of forms, and there's no real way to, like, assign history to it. And that's kind of problematic when you're an historian of religion, or in our case, like a historian of Japanese history. And so did he give up on comparative religion or quit academia? No, he did not. He really didn't. So, as he quotes, like, the only option appears to be no option at all. However, he also then goes on to maybe 3 newer methods, in his opinion, that could maybe handle this. And I say newer because they were new to him in 1982, which basically implies that these things sort of started evolving in, like, the 60s and 70s. And you can see that, like, in the case of, like, the statistical method. So, like, computers started becoming a lot more available at that point, and people really started wanting to, like, try to apply statistical methods that were, prior to, like, the 60s and 70s, kind of, like, hard to do by hand, but became a lot easier by computer, I would say. So, but he describes it as kind of, like, mostly a good tool, but not really, like, a good method itself. So those methods that have been proposed are statistical, could just be divided into ethnographic and encyclopedic methods, ultimately. He also describes a structural, like, method, which is kind of like morphology, and I don't really quite get this myself, less so about the Marxist. He says that it's with Marxists rather than idealist presuppositions. He actually believes that the Marxist part is pretty useful because, and I'm making an assumption here, the Marxist framework of the material dialectic, and, like, just, yeah, because it's material conditions, right? Yeah. Like, that's why I think he seems to prefer it over the idealistic or idealist. But Smith does not believe that it had worked out for the purpose of history yet in the writing, because we're living in a material world, and Oriko is a material girl or a material badger. And the final method here is what is the mouthful known as systematic description and comparison, which is to kind of just go through everything systematically and describe it and compare it and everything. But Smith thinks that's just kind of like an elegant form of the ethnographic method. So, I mean, he's like kind of poo-pooing everything here. Like, he does not believe that. He like goes into quite a bit of detail about these things, but the outcome of all of this is that none of these newer methods pass muster. It appears that each of these are but a variant of one of the four modes of comparison. So, at this point, like, he's actually just talked about, this is like section 1 of a 3-section essay. I'm just talking about the rest of the essay here because sections 2 and 3 are going into greater detail about like the methods that we're discussing before. Or rather, I should say that section 2, yeah, things aren't looking great so far, and they are not going to get better. So section 2 is essentially a description of an attempt to historicize morphology. So, and he talks about what was known as the Pan-Babylonian school. And he will, in section 3, also talk about like a few authors attempt to use systematic description and comparison. So just as a background, and he discusses it there, I kind of cribbed a little bit from Wikipedia for this too, but the Pan-Babylonian school is essentially like an early 20th century attempt to model the diffusion of Babylonian cultures and religions through the Middle East. In this case, like, Smith kind of likes it for its attempt to kind of like ground the comparison and patterns that the advocates of the school were doing into a historical process. And he just but the fundamental issue here is that the Pan-Babylonian school is factually wrong. Like, they got all the timelines wrong. Like, they thought things were a lot older than they actually were, and like a number of other things that kind of just undermined the entire like school of thought, to the point where after its main advocate died, it basically died out. But Smith likes it because of its attempt to like combine morphology, which he believes to have had some successes, and basically put it together with an attempt to like add history to it. So putting the two together would presumably provide a more like systematic and presumably objective way of doing comparisons. So as Smith says, like, we have yet to develop the responsible alternative, the integration of a complex notion of pattern and system with an equally complex notion of history. So the Pan-Babylonian school is kind of like a predecessor to the thing that he would like to see. And, the section 3 is the systematic description and comparison, where he goes through 3 different like major authors of the history of religion and their attempts to do this, and he ends up going back to what I had described before, which is just like all these different like just variants of the same methods described earlier. Probably outside the scope of this paper, but was the concept of a pattern language ever used in this field? I think I would need a lot more grounding in the history of religion to say if that was ever used. If you can elaborate a little bit on what you mean by pattern language, that would be helpful too. Because like I do believe that like certain vocabulary was developed, for example, and like different processes. So like one thing that Smith mentions is that I would say that something that came out of the Pan Babylonian school was the idea of myth and ritual, for example, which Smith refers to offhand, but is someone who's not well versed in the history of religion. I can't tell you what that actually means. Sure, I believe it originated in architecture as a collection of recurring ways to solve the same problem or achieve the same goal. Now, I'm not sure if they ever... So I would say that like some of the fundamentals of like the various fields of social science are like that. So like I hate to use this as an example because I haven't read too much in the way of anthropology, but if you think about the notion of anthropology being making kind of like every like human interaction like a ritual, or describing human interactions in the sense of rituals, might be a way of like thinking about a particular problem, I guess. Or another way you might think about it is that like there are different schools of historiography, right? Where in different ways, people like historians are trying to think about like how certain like society is like evolved or have changed over time. So one particular historiographical school was like modernization theory. So the question here, I suppose in this context there might be patterns like funeral practices. Yeah, I mean that might be one, for example. But yeah, so we think about modernization theory, for example. Like modernization theory was the notion that different civilizations or different like groups of people like modernize over time, so they become more modern. And what do we mean by modern? So a lot of that is like essentially like the Industrial Revolution and the certain like forms of like society, government, and that sort of thing that end up forming as a result of the consequences of an industrial revolution. So for much of the 20th century, for example, like a lot of debate and historical research around Japan was centered around modernization theory. So like how did the Bakumatsu how did the Bakumatsu like affect or like bring about modernization in Japan? So with that note, like we can actually talk about some like observations and stuff, but actually yeah, I may as well just go over the conclusion. And the conclusion that Smith essentially has here is like everything sucks and the question remains, which is how am I to apply what the one thing shows me to the case of two things? It's like I can't. It's like he's still. Yeah. No, there are two of them. Yeah. So yeah, like some observations and opinions about this paper, which in my estimation, I think it's a more difficult paper for me to like really kind of digest, and yet like I still want to present it because like if I keep putting it off, I would never do it, and I would never like actually write down the notes and thoughts I have about it. So even if I don't 100% understand it yet, it's something I wanted to talk about a bit. So like with this, I've got a couple of observations and opinions. So I can't speak about the history of religion specifically, but you can look at like other histories, and if you ever look at at a monograph or something, sometimes Don't worry, it's impossible to compare you to anyone else's presentations on this material. I don't think... I want to say that there has never been a Twitch streamer that has discussed this specific essay. So there you go. Yeah, like, if you ever look at a history monograph, a lot of times they're going to almost be compelled to make some sort of compare and contrast with another country. So, like, especially in Japan, right? Because with Japan, there's always, like, some segment, like, and inevitably it's because, like, it was in a dissertation and they had to put that in because, like, the thesis advisor wanted that. So it's always, like, compare and contrast, like, Japanese Japanese feudalism with, like, the feudalism in Europe or something like that, and it's usually, like, phoned in. It's very perfunctory, and typically it feels really weak. It's usually, like, the weakest part of any particular, like, monograph. And I think, like, a lot of that just comes to the fact that, yeah, it's phoned in to begin with. It's probably not something that the scholar wanted to write in the first place. But on top of that, it feels like there are not a lot of, like, rigorous tools to seriously do that comparison. It's just kind of like throw some stuff at the wall and it seems okay. Yeah, did medieval Japan have flails and morning stars? I don't know. Don't think so, but I do know that, like, there's like this weapon called a meteor hammer in China, and it's basically like a chain that connects two, like, metal weights. So yeah, that they've got that. Yeah. Yeah, they're pretty they're pretty mean. So, the other big thing that, like, what Smith is trying to get at is this idea of subjectivity versus objectivity. And to my recollection, Smith is very much a postmodernist. And by postmodernist, we talk about, like, kind of like how, like, subjectivity is kind of inherent in the practice and that objectivity can be kind of hard to find. But at the same time, it's like he very clearly kind of wants to reach that, especially, like, as a person who likes to talk about the human sciences. He really actually cares that what he's doing is a science. Personally, I think it's, like, kind of debatable about whether we can ever really remove the subjective from our study. In technology, like, there's this notion that you will, like, if you're given a project to complete, it will always take longer to complete the project, even if you take the law into account that says that, like, things are going to be longer. So, like, even if you know that you're biased or something like that, like, you can't 100% remove it. But, you know, I think we can account for it at least and try to be a little more rigorous in understanding that and trying to find methods that, if it can't eliminate subjectivity, at least we can try to reduce it as much as we can. You know, so, yeah. So, yeah, I guess a final thing I kind of liked is about the definition of terms. So one of Smith's preferences over time has been to kind of, like, define terms. Like, so, like, academics use a lot of technical language and, like, specific meanings for certain terms. So, like, they can very frequently be outside of what common usage is. So Smith is usually pretty good at trying to say what he means by comparison and what he means by, like, you know, science versus magic, for example. Like, he's being pretty clear about it. Academia is a word factory. Yeah. It's very much a word factory, and it's also, like, in many cases, a factory that does not label its goods. So I feel like in a lot of cases, a lot of scholars will define or use certain terms And they very clearly have a definition of that in mind, but are not explicit about defining it. And I think in Japanese studies, the best way you can see that for the Anglophone world is samurai, like the term samurai. Like every scholar, as we have seen in like prior presentation about like, the liminal samurai, as I called them, like there are like at least 3 big ways that people typically define what a samurai is. But it's not always clear which definition is being used in a given work, unless if that scholar is very explicit at the beginning about what they're talking about. But more often than not, they don't do that. So you have to piece it together yourself. So like, yeah, the Confucian scholar, for example, is that person a samurai? Well, depending on the scholar that you're reading, yes and no. So why did I study this? Why did I read this paper? Well, the thing is like, I kind of wanted to do some research into historical methods. I was trying to find where I read this, but I want to say it was like a Reddit post where there's a guy kind of complaining how like historians tend to be very weak on like comparativeness, like comparative studies, and that this was a good paper like to show what the problem was. So like if we talk about Japanese studies, for example, there's a couple of like places where comparisons often get made, especially like if you read stuff from the 20th century. Like you'll see like discussions about the nature of the bakufu, for example, like is it a feudal system and how is it a feudal system and how is it not like a feudal system? And so when people initially, like scholars initially talked about the bakufu, is it a system at all? It is a system. I happen to think that it's a system that is a very ad hoc one, where a lot of things were just sort of added over time. And much of its origins come from earlier practices. So, I don't know, I think as an American, like, I kind of... bakufu is a loose association of dudes with swords, yeah. But yeah, like, I think that as an American, like, our public education system likes to talk about how, like, the Constitution was, like, a pretty well-crafted thing with a lot of foresight, and the founders, like, knew X, Y, and Z, and they did this. So, like, after one not great try, they tried again and put together, like, a theoretically enduring and durable system, right? It was almost, like, influenced by certain things, but it was written as a clean slate. But the bakufu is not that. I mean, certainly you have like things like the buke shohato, that sort of thing, like laws that were kind of put out at the beginning. But my sense of all that has always been like, all this is built on prior, like very explicitly on prior methods of governance, right? And then as the bakufu evolved over time and like all these things continued to change, like all that was just like ad hoc. There's no clean slate that was put together. But, going back to like, feudalism, like, so that's kind of a debate to my mind that was sort of centered on a Eurocentric conception of feudal systems, like, the feudal systems of Europe. And, once more scholarship about how the bakufu actually operated, like that comparisons stopped being useful. Like, we have like we have other ideas like Mark Ravina's compound state, for example. But, ultimately, like, the notion of the bakufu as being feudal is something that's still in popular culture, so it's something that we still have to discuss. So, like, what else can we talk about? So we talk about, like, comparative development, for example. I bet you could get some valuable points of comparison with the general idea of hierarchy of personal allegiances. Yeah, that might actually be a pretty decent way of doing it. So like, not full feudalism, but yeah, putting together a system based on like fealty and allegiance. Yeah. Yeah, because like feudalism itself is like very much tied to the land, I guess. It's tied to the land, but we know that quite a lot of the allegiance that we see in the Tokugawa system is like really more predicated on income specifically, and not just like land and fiefs and stuff like that. Like much of that, of course, like essentially being like functionally fictional by the time the late Edo period rolls around. But if we going back to like the notion of comparative development, we talked a bit about modernization, right? So this was, and again, like this was a big interest in the 20th century, and I feel like it was somewhat related to like essentially opposing Marxist theories of history, essentially, because like Marxist theories of like history actually do kind of cover like modernization to a degree, because it's discussing like the evolution of a so-called feudal system of government becoming then like a bourgeois kind of system, which would ultimately, hopefully in Marxist thought, would be converted into like a proletarian or classless society. So the idea of modernization was kind of to come up with like this like idea of here's a modern state, like Europe and stuff like that, and how do other countries become like this sort of modern place. And there's a lot of comparisons there, and honestly, like if you look at the tool set, like there's a lot of like thinking, oh yeah, these things are similar, but only like a perfunctory amount of like these are how they're different. So yeah, like that's kind of it on my end. So we're going to talk about Joseph Campbell here, right? So like a common pattern in hero narratives. Now, let's see if we can unpack that. So like if I remember correctly, Joseph Campbell in his like Hero of a Thousand Faces like kind of came up with a set of like kind of like stories that seem to have like a universal applicability. Yeah, the hero's journey. And the thing with that, to my recollection, is that I have actually read that that particular narrative does not always come together in a lot of Asian and Chinese narratives. But I guess like, yeah, this is where we want to talk about like comparison. So like, without having read Hero of a Thousand Faces and talking about the hero's journey, like this is clearly like a set where it's like, oh yeah, this particular story seems very similar to this other story, right? So, but the question has to come in like, how are they different? When do they become different? Is there really a way where we can see like a common ancestor or something like that? So like, how do we know that when he saw these similarities, is that where's the objective criteria that says that these things are in fact similar, and not just like Joseph Campbell looking at these two things going, oh yeah, like those are clearly related, like that. So like the thing about this paper is that this is a type of paper that states a problem but does not provide a solution. And it helps that like this was originally a lecture and then became an essay. So, and it's entirely proper to have like papers and essays where the solution is like an open problem, because sometimes you don't have that. And what's funny is that the PDF that I have of this, and happens to be in the link, also includes like an epilogue to a particular book that this essay was republished in. And I was going to do a slide on it, but like I kind of ran out of time. But it kind of like ruminates a bit on the 20 years between the publication of this essay we're discussing and this epilogue that I'm talking about at the moment. And he kind of puts together like a framework for how one could use comparison, but also this essay is like 4 pages long or something like that. It's not very big, not very long, and it's not going into a whole lot of detail. So I think maybe at some point I'll take a look at it, but in more depth, but for now it's kind of out of scope. So yeah, with that being said, that's basically it on my end for this paper. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to share it. Like, please feel free to share, and I'd be happy to try to answer it as best as I can. I feel like the message of this paper is don't try. I feel like I wouldn't say the message of the paper is don't try so much as we need new tools. Stop using these existing ones because they don't work. And for what it's worth, he did attempt to, based on the epilogue, he did try to do some answers in his subsequent work in those 20 years intervening. But yeah, like it does seem like it's very stark. You know, like he's basically saying that the entire edifice that his field is based on is broken. Yeah, so yeah, it could be better. Yep. So yeah, I think that's it on my end. Like let's go back to the interior. Yeah, so thank you for listening to my talk. A little different than what we were used to. But at least it's I did find it to be a little challenging, but it's good to have some challenge here and there. Not sure what I'm going to cover next, but yeah, I'm glad that I did it, regardless of like what ended up like whatever ended up happening, so with that being said, I think I'm going to sign off. Now, I don't really see anybody to raid at the moment, so without further ado, I hope I wouldn't have encountered this paper otherwise, so thanks. Yeah, you're quite welcome. Yeah, I do find the work interesting, and I might try to see some of his other papers. But yeah, like I feel like I'm gonna need a little more grounding in like the forms of like religious history in order to like properly like read his stuff, though. I think it's like even if the tools are multidisciplinary, the context is somewhat alien to me. But yeah, so I hope to see you all next time, and I hope you guys have a good evening. Okay, bye.